Hey beauties, Rosie here from rosypeñapattern.com. I am a sewing pattern designer as well as a sewing content creator at rosypeña.com. So in today's video, we are going to be making my latest pattern, which is the Eva top or dress. I'm super excited about this pattern because it is my first release in several years. It's so beautiful. I'll put a little clip of her here. I feel like my design perspective has changed so much since my last pattern release. So I'm just so excited to share my new designs with you. I feel like my approach now is a lot more simple, clean, modern, stylish, chic. I just really want them to be very beginner friendly, as well as stuff that I can actually see in my closet. The Eva pattern is actually available now. You can get it in the link in my description box below, or you can just watch the video tutorial and learn a lot of great tips about sewing with knit. Before we get started with the tutorial, I just want to give you some sewing tips, just tips in general, and then also tips for working with knit fabrics. And then I also want to give you some tips about selecting your pattern size, as well as grading between sizes and just making sure that the pattern is going to fit you really well at the end. So as far as sewing supplies, you have to make sure that you have machine needles that are specifically designed for sewing with knit fabric. So these are going to be your Jersey ballpoint needles. And then you can also just test these out on your fabric, see which needles are working best with your fabrics. Next tip is to definitely use a walking foot on your machine. So most sewing machines have this come standard with the sewing machine, so you don't have to go out and buy extra sewing machine feet. But if not, I highly recommend getting a walking foot. It is going to make the biggest difference for your seams. Whenever you use a regular foot on your sewing machine, you're going to have a lot of wavy lines. But if you're using a walking foot, it's going to make sure that the fabric is feeding through those feed dogs evenly from the top and the bottom, so that you're not going to end up with those wavy seams. So definitely make sure you're using a walking foot. When it comes to hemming the garment, so finishing the lower hem of the garment, if you're using a walking foot, I think you'll be fine. But you can also opt for some hem bond tape. So this is the soft version, the light version. So I don't recommend using anything that is heavy. It's gonna make your hem look really stiff. Using hem bond is another option that you can use for knit fabrics, just because it can get a little tricky working on the hems. But again, if you're using your walking foot, I think you'll be okay. My next sewing tip, not specifically for knits, but just sewing in general, I have been loving these Wonder Clips. So these Wonder Clips are just so amazing. They're so much easier than pinning. You can just clip them on really quick and clip them off really quick. And I just keep them in here. And like I said, I've been using them so much more than sewing pins for certain projects. And these work really well for the Eva pattern. So the next supplies that I will recommend, but of course not absolutely 100% needed, but I do recommend once you are wearing your dress, I do recommend maybe just investing in some shapewear. This is a really fitted garment. It's gonna really hug at your side seams and around your belly. So I've just found that getting some shapewear really makes the biggest difference whenever you're wearing fitted garments. So I will link this and all the other materials that I'm talking about in this video in the description bar below. So the Eva pattern also comes kind of down and can be a little bit revealing, especially if you have a larger chest. So another thing that I recommend is fashion tape. So if you're afraid of the Eva pattern maybe being a little bit too revealing, you can use some fashion tape, which is just like a double-sided sticky tape, just to make sure that everything stays in place. So my next tip is going to be about fitting. So sewing patterns are not perfect molds for everybody's body. Sewing patterns are templates for the body to get you a certain style design. So I really want you to look at the finished garment measurements and compare those with your actual body measurements. So the Eva pattern is designed with negative ease because the knit fabric will stretch over your body. Finished garment measurements are actually going to be smaller or equal to your actual body measurement. Whenever you're selecting your size, just keep that in mind, that the design has negative ease. And then also I want you to get comfortable with grading between sizes. So my body is kind of pear-shaped. I'm smaller in my chest and then my hips kind of just come out. So I'm going to be showing you in this video how I grade or blend between sizes from a smaller chest area to a wider hip. So if you have maybe smaller hips and a bigger chest, you can do that same grading technique but in the opposite way. So it's a really easy process. One of the great things about my pattern is that they are layered, so you can select your own specific size or sizes that you would like to sew. So if you want to grade from a small to a large or from a medium to an extra large, you can just select those sizes so that you don't have the other sizes in the view. So that makes it really great whenever you're trying to grade between sizes. My next tip is that you really want to make sure that you find knit fabric that has good stretch recovery. You don't want to buy fabrics that don't have good stretch recovery. So if you stretch your fabric and it kind of goes back to its shape, that has good stretch recovery. If you stretch your fabric and it kind of stays wavy or doesn't stretch back, that's not a good knit that you really want to work with, especially with a fitted knit garment. The next tip is that you want to try on your garment as you sew. So once you have those side seams sewn up, before you proceed after that, just try on your garment and see how it's fitting. Maybe you're already finding that you need to take in at the side seam or let out at the hips. So definitely try on your garment as you are sewing and make those adjustments in the process of sewing. That way you will have a really nice, beautiful garment that fits you at the end. Another tip is whenever you are pressing your seams, you don't want to drag your iron over your fabric. You really want to press. So put your iron down, press, lift your iron, press. If you're dragging, you're really going to stretch out that fabric and it's going to end up all bent out of shape and it's not going to look good. So those are all my tips for sewing with knits and sewing the Eva pattern in general. If you guys have any other tips that you want to leave to help out other sewers, definitely leave those in the comments. Now you can go ahead and start sewing the Eva pattern. To make the Eva pattern, I first want you to measure your bust, waist, and hip. Once you have those measurements, I want you to compare that to the sizing chart on the Eva pattern. To assemble your pattern pieces, just look at the print at home instructions diagram, and then we're going to lay out our pattern pieces using the diagram as a guide. So the first row has 8 pages. The second row has 8 pages as well, and the third row has 8 pages. So I'm grabbing 8 pages at a time and I'm cutting along the page border and I'm taping the sheets together, matching the triangles and the numbers. So 1A is going to line up to 1A and so on. Just make sure that your pages are flush side by side, matching those letters and numbers, and then just tape your pattern pieces in place. Each of the sizes has a different dotted line to mark that size. Once you have all of your pages taped together, just cut out your pattern pieces. So you should have number 1, which is your front piece, number 2, which is your back piece, and pattern piece number 3, which is your front band and your back band and your necktie. I'm going to blend from a size medium from the waist up to a size large at the hip. So from the waist up, I'm just going to cut out a size medium. And then I'm going to grab my hip curve ruler and I'm going to start at the waist and then just blend a new line from the medium size waist to the large size hip. You just want to repeat that same process to the side seam of your front pattern piece as well. And then you can compare the sizes by bringing one piece on top of the other at the side seam. Align those side seams and make sure that everything is nice and even on both sides. Now you should have cut pattern piece number 1, which is your front, pattern piece number 2, which is your back, and pattern piece number 3, which is your front and back neckband and neckties. With right sides facing, I want you to pin or clip your back pieces together, matching those notches at the center back. I like to clip at one end first, then the opposite end, and then I like to just clip evenly throughout. With right sides facing, clip the short ends of your tie pieces together. To make sure your finished dress looks really beautiful, I want you to make sure that you have some knit, jersey, ballpoint machine sewing needles, and then also I want you to use a walking foot. Trust me, it makes the biggest difference in your final product. It takes a little bit of time to attach the walking foot, but trust me, it's worth it. I want you to use a stretch stitch on your sewing machine. So a lot of times it'll look like a lightning bolt, or you can also use a zigzag stitch. This fabric is a knit fabric, so that means that it stretches quite a bit, and you want to make sure that your stitches are going to stretch along with your fabric as well. So again, make sure you're using a stretch stitch. Sew along the back seam with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, making sure to backstitch at the beginning of your seam and at the end of your seam as well. Go ahead and sew your band piece with 1/2 inch seam allowance as well, along that short edge. I want you to take your fabric to your ironing table and you're going to press that seam flat. Once you've pressed your seam flat, I want you to open up that seam and then just press that flat as well. Next, we're going to grab our band piece and we're going to press that seam open. And then we're going to fold the fabric onto itself with the wrong sides facing, and we're going to press that flat as well. We're going to do that along the entire length of the tie. I want you to place your front to your back with the right sides facing, and then you're just going to pin or clip along the entire side seam. So I like to clip at the bottom and then clip at the top, and then I just evenly clip all throughout the side seam. And then you're just going to turn that fabric over and you're going to repeat that to the other side seam as well. Once you have both side seams pinned or clipped, take your fabric to your sewing machine and you're going to sew again with a stretch stitch and 1/2 inch seam allowance along the entire side seam. Repeat that to your other side seam as well, just removing those clips as you go. Take your fabric to your ironing table and I just want you to press those seams that you just sewed. Continue that throughout your entire side seams. Now you can choose to neaten these seams with a serger, but I wanted to show you guys that you don't need a serger to sew this dress or top. The great thing about knit fabric is it doesn't fray. So we're just going to trim down our seam allowances to about 1/8 inch. Now we're going to clip that center seam of our band to the center seam of our top or dress with the right sides facing. So just bring the center seam of your band to the center seam of the back top or dress and clip that in place. With the raw edges of all layers pointing up, I want you to slightly stretch the band along one side of the back and front, just making sure you have an even amount of fabric each time you stretch. Repeat that same process for the other side, starting from the center back and working in the opposite direction. Take your fabric to your sewing machine and we're going to start at that neck point marking. If you need to, you can move some of those clips out of the way just to get a better angle as you sew. Just start at that neck point and you're going to sew with 1/2 inch seam allowance using the stretch stitch all the way throughout. Neck point is one of the most important parts of this dress, so I like to always just go back and make sure that my stitches are meeting at the neck point marking. If you need to, you can go back to your sewing machine and just make sure that those stitches meet each other and they come to a point like an upside down V. Follow step number 5 on your pattern instructions and you're going to make a snip through all layers within the seam allowance to that neck point marking. Now we're going to trim the seam allowance down to about 1/8 inch. You can use these small curved scissors or you can use your rotary cutter. If you're using your rotary cutter, just make sure that you're working only within that seam allowance and that all of your other layers of your fabric are out of the way. Now we can press that band seam allowance down and the band up away from the top or dress. And then we're just going to tuck in the remaining seam allowance at the neck point and along the entire length of the ties. So with the wrong sides of your ties facing up, folding those raw edges in to meet the crease line in the center. And then you're going to repeat that step one more time, again just folding the fabric onto itself and pressing it flat. Repeat that same process to your other tie as well. The neck point is my favorite part, so I like to just make sure that I have all of my seams neatened up and that all of those raw edges are tucked in nice and neat, and then I just press that flat. We can take our fabric to our sewing machine and we're going to sew along the entire length of the ties. I'm going to be using a long straight stitch for this part just because I think it gives it a neater finish. To neaten up those raw edges of the tie, I'm just going to tie a little knot at the very end of the tie and then I'm going to clip off that excess fabric and repeat that to the other tie as well. Now this step is optional, but you can top stitch along the front and back band of the dress, catching that seam allowance underneath. Now I just want you to try on your dress and see how much you would like to hem your dress. Once you've determined that, you can use a seam gauge and just press up that hem allowance along the entire hem of the dress. And you can just use your seam gauge to help you along. Just measuring up however much you would like to hem the dress all the way around the hem. And you can take your fabric to your sewing machine and you're just going to top stitch that hem in place. Once you've finished hemming your dress, the last step is just to create a cross wrap around your front neck with the ties, and you can make a little bow at the back, adjusting the fit as needed. Once you're finished with that step, you're all done with your Eva pattern. The Eva pattern will be linked in the description box below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to grab your Eva pattern at rosypeñapatterns.com, and I will see you in my next video. Bye guys!